In the heart of ancient India, long before the rise of modern empires and the thunder of muskets, there existed a form of justice so cruel, so theatrically horrifying, that it became etched into the annals of history as one of the most terrifying punishments ever conceived by humankind. It was called execution by elephant, a death not merely designed to end life, but to crush dignity, terrorize the population, and broadcast the absolute power of a king who ruled not with mercy, but with absolute, terrifying authority. Imagine a sun-scorched courtyard, paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of sandals and the pounding of countless feet. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that twists the stomach and makes hearts pound with equal parts fear and fascination. A crowd gathers, from the wealthiest nobleman to the lowliest servant, all bound by curiosity, loyalty, or simple terror. The condemned stands at the center, chained and trembling. He or she might be a rebel who dared defy the ruler, a criminal who betrayed trust, or even a noble who committed treason. In ancient India, the elephants did not discriminate. They were the ultimate enforcers of law and punishment, trained for death in ways that could make the strongest stomachs quiver. Elephants, revered in India as symbols of wisdom and power, were transformed by kings into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. Their training was rigorous, precise, and merciless. From a young age, these animals were taught to obey commands with terrifying accuracy, responding to subtle signals that only their mahouts, their handlers, could give. They were trained to break the human body as easily as a twig, to trample, crush, and gore with precision that could turn execution into both spectacle and instrument of fear. To watch an elephant in the act of execution was to confront nature's raw, unbridled force directed with the cold efficiency of human design. The condemned would often be brought to courtyard on a platform or a raised stone dais, sometimes adorned with ropes or chains that would only partially restrain them. They might be forced to kneel or, in some cases, stand upright, their arms bound behind their back, as the crowd murmured in hushed tones, fearful and fascinated in equal measure. The elephants themselves were sometimes adorned, painted with bright colors and bedecked in jewels, not as a sign of mercy, but as a stark contrast, the grandeur of life and civilization versus the looming threat of obliteration. And then, with a suddenness that would make even the bravest heart falter, the mahout would give the signal. The elephant, immense and lumbering, would step forward. The first contact was always deliberate. A single foot would press against a stone, the earth trembling beneath it, sending a shiver through the onlookers. Then, the animal's massive head would lower, tusks gleaming, eyes glinting with trained menace. The crowd would hold its breath, aware that within moments, the condemned's fate would be sealed. What makes execution by elephant particularly horrifying is that it was not always a single, swift act. Ancient Indian kings often demanded performance of death, a protracted spectacle that would demonstrate not only the power of the ruler, but also the absolute futility of resistance. The elephant could break bones, crush limbs, or gore with tusks, inflicting pain that could last minutes or even hours. Sometimes the condemned was intentionally spared immediate death, forced to endure partial injuries that rendered them incapable of resistance while prolonging their terror. This cruelty was calculated, a psychological weapon against anyone who might dream of defiance. Accounts from travelers and historians of the time describe the method with chilling detail. Some report that the elephant would first lift the victim with its trunk, tossing them into the air like a toy, only to hurl them against the stone pavement. Others recount the sight of an elephant pressing its massive foot on the chest of a prisoner, feeling the ribcage crack under the overwhelming weight. Occasionally, a tusk would impale, piercing through flesh and bone in a way that made survival nearly impossible. The very air would vibrate with the sound of screams, trumpeting of the elephant, and the hushed, horrified gasps of the spectators. But there was more to this than brute force. Execution by elephant was a demonstration of hierarchy, a visceral lesson etched into the memory of every witness. Kings understood that the terror itself was as much a tool of control as the act of death. People remember the faces of the condemned, twisted in agony, the way the elephant moved with both majesty and monstrous intent, and the authority of the ruler who had ordered it. This spectacle became a story whispered across kingdoms, a warning that rebellion would meet a fate both public and grotesque. Interestingly, the elephants themselves were considered more than mere instruments. They were almost co-executors of justice. Their training allowed them to act with intelligence that seemed intentional, almost judicial. Some Mahouts were said to have trained their elephants to crush certain limbs first, or to avoid immediately killing the condemned, ensuring maximum terror while demonstrating control over both life and death. A skilled elephant, trained for the purpose of execution, could almost read the movement of a human body, reacting with horrifying accuracy to any attempt at escape or defiance. Yet, despite the fear, there was a strange, macabre fascination with these events. The people of ancient India, like societies across the world, were drawn to spectacles of extreme punishment, seeing them not only as justice, but as a form of theater. Scholars suggest that these executions were intended to solidify social hierarchies, to remind both the elite and the commoner that the king's power was absolute, that nature itself, when harnessed by human will, could become an agent of terrifying authority. And so, in the sweltering heat of the Indian sun, as dust swirled around the courtyard and the crowd leaned in, the condemned faced a reality that transcended fear. The unstoppable force of a living mountain, the elephant, trained not as an animal of peace, but as a weapon of unparalleled destruction. Each step, each swing of the massive head, each stomp of the enormous foot carried the weight not only of flesh and bone, but of centuries of human intent, cruelty, and a desire for control. The story of execution by elephant is not just a tale of death. It is a glimpse into the psyche of a world where power and terror were inseparable. It forces us to confront the extremes of human imagination in the realm of punishment, and the ways in which societies have sought to instill fear to maintain order. It is a story of kings and criminals, of Mahouts and elephants, of life reduced to a spectacle, and death rendered a public theater of horror. And yet, for every account we have, for every historian who recorded the screams and the crushing of bones, there remains a haunting question. How did anyone survive the shadow of such power? How did societies reconcile the sanctity of life with the deliberate orchestration of agony? These questions linger in the mind, long after the echoes of the elephant steps have faded into the pages of history. The terror, the suspense, the sheer physical and psychological horror of execution by elephant is a story that resonates even today, over 1,000 years later. It reminds us that while civilizations rise and fall, the human capacity for both cruelty and ingenuity remains, etched in the annals of time, waiting for those who dare to read history in its rawest, most unfiltered form. As the centuries passed in ancient India, the fear of execution by elephant became more than legend. It became an instrument of political strategy, a tool wielded by kings and emperors to silence dissent, to crush rebellion, and to assert dominance over subjects who dare question their authority. While the courtyard scenes were terrifying enough in theory, history tells us that the practice was applied with methodical cruelty, often tailored to the crimes and social standing of the condemned. In the annals of the Deccan and Bengal, there are accounts of nobles who once considered themselves untouchable, forced to confront their mortality under the looming shadow of the execution elephant. One story, passed down by travelers in the 16th century, speaks of a courtier who dared oppose the king's tax reforms. His defiance was considered treason. He was brought before the royal elephant, a massive, gray colossus with tusks sharpened to gleaming points and eyes black as midnight, and ordered to kneel. The crowd fell silent, aware that a single misstep could signal a lifetime of terror or the sudden end of it. The Mahout, a figure as terrifying in his own right as the elephant, whispered commands in a language only the animal could understand. Then, in a heartbeat, the elephant lunged. Witnesses recounted the sickening sound of bones snapping under its feet, a noise described as equal parts thunder and human anguish. Limbs were broken. The air was filled with screams, and yet the king's court demanded more. The condemned man, though paralyzed by pain, was lifted by the elephant's trunk, spun through the air, and hurled to the stone floor with horrifying precision. Survival was improbable. Yet there were rare moments when someone endured long enough of the spectacle to etch itself permanently into the minds of the audience. It is these rare instances of survival that make execution by elephant even more horrifying. The elephant was not merely a blunt instrument. It was trained to inflict maximum suffering. Survivors, when they existed, were often left horribly maimed, living reminders of both their disobedience and the absolute authority of the ruler. One account tells of a soldier who attempted to escape punishment after betraying his commander. The elephant caught him mid-flight, pinning him beneath its massive weight. Yet he survived, albeit with shattered legs and permanent injuries. The king spared his life, not out of mercy, but to send a message. Defiance would be punished, pain would be unavoidable, and the memory of it would last a lifetime. The psychological dimension of this punishment cannot be overstated. Imagine standing before a living mountain of muscle, tusks, and memory, knowing that it had been trained to respond to subtle human signals to destroy you. The tension in the air was almost palpable, an electric current that flowed to the crowd and the condemned alike. In some regions, the condemned were not executed immediately. Instead, they were made to watch others suffer first, a deliberate orchestration of terror designed to maximize fear and compliance. Accounts suggest that prisoners sometimes fainted from sheer terror even before the elephant approached, their minds succumbing to the anticipation of obliteration. Some kings, notorious for their cruelty, refined the spectacle into a form of gruesome theater. One ruler in the Mysore region reportedly used multiple elephants in his executions. The condemned would be chained in the center of a large courtyard, while trained elephants circled, stomped, and tossed them like rag dolls. Witnesses recalled that the combination of power, weight, and precision was almost surgical in its effectiveness. Yet, the horror was compounded by the deliberate prolongation of suffering. The victim's limbs could be broken, bones snapped, flesh crushed, and still, the elephant would pause, allowing the condemned to writhe and scream in front of an audience of hundreds, sometimes thousands. Even foreigners who visited the courts were struck by the brutality of these practices. European traitors and ambassadors, writing letters and diaries, described the experience in disbelief, sometimes with morbid fascination. One account from the early 17th century speaks of a Portuguese trader who witnessed an execution in Bengal. He wrote of an elephant, trained for execution, lifting a man into the air with its trunk and tossing him repeatedly against a stone platform. The man survived the initial assault, but only long enough to witness the sheer size and intelligence of the animal and the absolute control of the mahout. By the time the execution ended, the courtyard was silent except for survivors' wheezing breaths and the distant murmurs of the crowd, each spectator understanding that the king's will was absolute. Execution by elephant was not merely punishment. It was a form of moral theater. Kings used it to communicate messages to their people, ensuring that the consequences of disobedience were visible, immediate, and unforgettable. Those who ruled or rebelled, cheated or betrayed, learned that the elephant could crush not only the body, but the will to resist. Even the mere threat of such an execution was often enough to maintain order in a kingdom, as stories of maimed survivors and obliterated rebels spread through villages, towns, and cities like wildfire. However, the cruelty was not uniform. Some rulers reportedly used the elephants with what could be considered a dark sense of mercy, though mercy, in this context, was relative. For minor crimes, or for those deemed worthy of final warning, the elephant could be trained to inflict pain without immediately killing. A limb might be broken, the body pinned to the ground, yet life preserved for a few more agonizing minutes. This partial execution served as both punishment and deterrent, a living lesson in the consequences of betrayal. The elephant, in these moments, became a tool of pedagogy, teaching obedience in the most visceral way imaginable. Interestingly, there were tales of elephants showing what seemed like hesitation or recognition. Stories circulated of animals that refused to strike at certain individuals, particularly children or those deemed innocent by circumstance. Whether these were exaggerations, myth, or isolated incidents, they contributed to the mystique of the execution elephants. They were not mere instruments. They were actors in a ritual of terror, with instincts and intelligence that could amplify the horror when properly harnessed. And so, across the sprawling territories of ancient India, the elephant became synonymous with fear and absolute authority. Its presence alone could quell rebellion, silence dissent, and impose respect for crown. Parents warned children, merchants warned apprentices, and soldiers warned one another. To defy the king was to risk being crushed by a force beyond comprehension. The chilling reality is that this form of execution required no consent, no trial in the sense we understand today. A king's word was law, and the elephant was the final arbiter of that law. Tales of the condemned surviving for a few moments, or even hours, under the relentless weight and precision of the animal only served to deepen the fear, transforming execution by elephant from mere punishment into a psychological weapon that extended far beyond the courtyard. It is in these stories of survival, terror, and the absolute power of the ruler that we begin to understand why execution by elephant is remembered as one of history's most horrifying methods of death. It combined physical destruction, psychological torment, and the awe-inspiring majesty of one of the largest and most intelligent land animals on Earth. The elephant was more than a tool. It was a spectacle, a warning, a symbol of the unassailable might of the king who commanded it. Even today, when we read the accounts of travelers, chroniclers, and historians, the terror is palpable. The screams, the crushing weight, the twisted bodies of condemned, and the silent, looming presence of the elephant all come alive in our imagination. Execution by elephant was not just death. It was an experience designed to imprint itself upon the minds of every witness, to make the power of the ruler an unforgettable, almost mythical force. And so, as we continue this journey into the shadowy corners of history, we begin to see the human need to control, to dominate, and to communicate fear in the most primal ways. Execution by elephant is not simply a tale of death. It is a window into a civilization, its rulers, its values, and its capacity for both ingenuity and cruelty. The elephants, with their immense power and precision, became living instruments of terror, etching a story of fear that would endure for centuries. As centuries passed, the reign of terror imposed by execution elephants began to wane, not because rulers became merciful, but because societal structures, trade, and governance evolved in ways that made such brutal spectacles increasingly impractical. The rise of more organized bureaucracies, codified laws, and the influence of foreign powers introduced new methods of punishment. Yet, even as the practice declined, the fear it instilled did not vanish. Stories of elephants trampling rebels, crushing traitors, and hurling the defiant into the air continue to circulate, passed down by storytellers, chroniclers, and travelers. The memory of these events became a haunting reminder of what absolute power could achieve. In some regions, kings began to phase out public executions in favor of imprisonment or exile, but the shadow of the elephant lingered. Even those spared from death by tusk were aware that a single misstep could summon the beast once more. The terror itself had achieved its purpose, embedding respect, or more accurately, fear, into the fabric of society. Families would warn their children, merchants would caution their apprentices, and soldiers would remind one another of the consequences of defiance. Execution by elephant became less about punishment and more about psychological control, a lingering echo of an era when kings ruled through spectacle as much as law. Historians and scholars have long debated the ethical and psychological implications of these executions. From a modern perspective, they appear as acts of barbaric cruelty, yet in their historical context, they were part of a broader system of governance designed to maintain order in vast, often fractious kingdoms. The elephants were not merely tools of death. They were instruments of political theater, symbols of unassailable power, and reminders that human ingenuity could manipulate even the greatest of creatures into agents of control. The method's effectiveness lay not only in the physical destruction it caused, but in the indelible terror imprinted upon every witness. Interestingly, the legacy of execution by elephant extends beyond historical texts and legends. In literature, folklore, and even local rituals, the imagery of the elephant as a destroyer of defiance persists. It serves as a metaphor for overwhelming force, a reminder that nature, when harnessed by human will, can become both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The tales of maimed survivors, heroic or defiant final acts, and the majesty of the animals themselves continue to capture the imagination, influencing stories of power, justice, and cruelty across cultures. For the elephants themselves, their dual role as revered creatures and instruments of death is a stark reflection of the human desire to dominate and control. In temples, they were symbols of wisdom and divinity. In the king's court, they became agents of terror. This duality mirrors the complexity of ancient Indian society, where reverence and fear, religion and law, beauty and brutality coexisted in a delicate, often terrifying balance. As we reflect on these chilling executions today, centuries removed from the stone-paved courtyards and the thundering steps of trained elephants, we are confronted with the extremes of human imagination and cruelty. Execution by elephant was not merely a form of punishment. It was a performance of absolute power, a testament to the human capacity to engineer fear, and a demonstration of how societies have historically wielded both animals and authority to enforce obedience. The story lingers because it touches something primal within us. The tension between awe and terror, respect and fear, life and death. Execution by elephant is more than a historical footnote. It is a window into a world where survival could hinge on a single step of a massive, intelligent beast, and where kings transformed nature into an instrument of absolute justice. The echoes of that terror, preserved in chronicles, legends, and imagination, endure, a stark reminder that history is often written not just in victories and monuments, but in fear, cruelty, and the terrifying beauty of power.